Hello, Calaveras County. You saw it at the beginning of the show. I'm Mike Taylor, and the doctor is in. The doctor, of course, is Dr. Randy Smart. Dr. Smart, how are you?
Hi, Mike. Thank you for having me today.
You bet. Now, we're coming into springtime. We're all going to get busy, and kids are going to be playing softball and baseball and all that fun stuff, and somebody's going to break their bones. And we're going to talk about bones today and a little bit more about osteoporosis and how that affects the population.
Exactly.
Fill us in on that.
So here is the issue. A 60-year-old female walks out her front door to get the mail, has a misstep or something, falls, lands on her wrist, breaks her wrist. We have two medical problems. One is that she has a broken wrist. Mm-hmm. Two is you don't usually break a wrist simply from falling from that height.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
That's not that's not a normal thing. If you take a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old, they fall from that height, they don't break their wrist.
Yeah, they just bounce and stand right up again.
and you may even have a third problem, and the third problem is maybe she shouldn't have fallen at all. Mm-hmm. You know, why did she fall? I mean, people do trip and people do have accidents, but people, as they age, have more and more problems falling, balance, staying steady. So that one episode of trying to get the mail and breaking the wrist is really a collage of medical problems. And it's an important collage. Sure.
And so is it that fall and the broken wrist that generally alerts her and her healthcare providers that she might have osteoporosis? Or
exactly. Those are what we call fragility fractures. And so somebody who has a ground level fall and maybe breaks a part of their back or a wrist or a hip. Those are called fragility fractures, and we think those fragility fractures are really diagnostic for osteoporosis. Before you ever do any testing, just that event alone is diagnostic.
I guess let's back up and kind of what's going on with osteoporosis, and is it something that really just affects us as we get older? I don't hear much of it being talked about in folks, say, under 50, and that's just me and what I've heard in the media in that.
So as we age, all of our organs age, our stomachs and our hearts and our lungs, but certainly the skeletal system and the bones age. And as we age, they lose their strength and they become much more porous and probably more brittle. And there's several theories about that. One of the most prominent theories has to do with hormones and estrogen.
Okay.
And as those bones become more brittle, what's interesting is you have no symptoms. So if that were happening to you or I, we wouldn't know it. It doesn't hurt.
No.
It doesn't cause any problem until we fall and break something, and then it hurts. So it's part of the aging process. There are what we call secondary causes of osteoporosis. There are medicines that can do that and diseases that can do that. But for the most part, this is an aging process. It occurs in patients or people that are over 60, 65. And it's really an epidemic, and it's an epidemic that's growing, and
really
an epidemic that's pretty devastating.
I can imagine it being, you fall, you break your wrist, you trip next week, you break the other wrist. I could imagine that someone who's got it has got to be almost walking around in that plastic bubble to keep themselves safe.
Exactly, if it's recognized. Now, in a lot of cases, that wrist will get casted, it'll get x-rayed, it'll get casted, the person will return to the home environment or the work environment, but the bell doesn't go off. Nobody says, wait a minute, why did that break? And why did she fall? We simply put the cast on, say, well, it'll heal in 6 to 8 weeks, try not to use it a lot, and hopefully we don't see a lot again.
Yeah.
But we don't follow through with that in a lot of cases.
Okay.
And but to give you an example of the epidemic proportions of this, and I was looking at some numbers earlier today, something like every 3 seconds, somebody falls and breaks a bone.
Wow.
1, 2, break. 1, 2, break.
That's a lot of broken bones.
That's a lot of broken bones. And every 11 seconds, somebody is in an emergency room because of a fall and probably a fracture. Every 19 minutes, somebody dies in this country from a complication related to a fracture, a fall and a fracture. Every 19 minutes.
Really? I've never really heard of broken bones being deadly.
Right. You wouldn't think so. But
Yeah.
if you take twins, let's say 60-year-old twins, let's say our patient, and let's say she broke her hip rather than her wrist. If she breaks her hip and she has a twin that has a heart attack same day, same time, the heart attack patient is much more likely to survive.
Really? What are the reasons for that? Or do we even know?
Well, they fixing the hip or surgically reducing the hip and correcting the hip is relatively straightforward and common. But then somebody's laying in bed and maybe they get blood clots, maybe they can't breathe so well, maybe they get pneumonia, maybe they get bed sores, maybe they have skin breakdown. And typically these are people with not a lot of reserve. So a little thing becomes a big thing. So they lay in bed and suddenly they wheeze. And then suddenly they may have a blood clot. And suddenly you put them on blood thinners. And then, the blood thinners have complications.
Yeah.
And then they have skin breakdown. And, within a year, they're gone.
They've almost literally crumbled.
They're gone. Yes, exactly.
What is osteoporosis?
So it is, if you think of your bones, they kind of have the structure of a sponge. Now, they're not soft like a sponge, but they have the structure of a sponge. And envision that sponge, those holes getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so you no longer have that matrix, that structure
That
to keep
provides that strength?
Right. And that bone becomes then more fragile and more brittle. Now, we think it's because the calcium leaks out of those bones. And it does it for lots of different reasons, but it's called resorption. And that calcium comes out of the bones, and the bones become weaker and weaker to the point where they can maybe move your arm, move your leg, you can walk, but just a simple thing like that, and it breaks.
Wow, and you're going to snap it. My goodness.
And you snap it. That's exactly right.
So it sounds like just popping calcium supplements would then be our sort of preventative measure for this. Is that how this works?
Sort of. But let's focus for a minute with who's really at risk for this.
Okay.
And I was so excited about telling you this because every time you and I talk about the risk for disease, who gets this, what is the thing I always bring up?
Diet.
Weight.
Weight and diet.
And you say, man, being overweight is a risk for everything. Being overweight is not a risk for this.
Okay.
It's the first time you and I have found a disease.
It really is.
So being thin is a risk.
Oh,
Right,
okay.
being thin is a risk. Being malnourished is a risk.
Oh, no reserves.
And some of our seniors don't have adequate nutrition, and so if you look at the sort of poster child of osteoporosis, you would see a skinny white woman smoking a cigarette. That's who gets this disease.
That's who's going to have
Right,
osteoporosis.
that's who gets this disease. So malnutrition or just being skinny or maybe having one of these strict vegetarian diets. Smoking is a big risk factor. And it's probably one of the strongest risk factors now that I think about it. Inactivity is a risk factor. Sitting around doing nothing, not putting any weight on those bones, not using those bones.
Kind of encouraging them to remain strong, huh?
Right. Letting them respond to weight and stress and exercise. And then age. I mean, those are the folks that are at risk. Now, there's some other diseases and other issues, but for the most part, those are the folks that are at risk. So they could pop calcium supplements. I think that's the phrase you use.
Yeah, you could say it that way.
Yeah, they could do that. But the first thing they probably want to do is find out from the doc whether they are at risk or not. And they can be tested. And there's a test called a bone densitometry test. It's abbreviated DEXA.
Okay.
But it's really bone densitometry. It's like an X-ray, and it measures the thickness of the bone and the calcification of the bone. And that test is paid for by every medical insurance company I know.
Okay.
Medicare, which most of these folks have if they're over 65, but certainly Blue Cross, Blue Shield, United Healthcare, everyone pays for it. It's a very easy test to do. It's done in Calaveras County. There's a couple different centers that do it. It can't take more than about 5 minutes. So kind of one of the first things you would want to do is get the test. Now, if you don't have insurance and you don't have access to the test, or you're busy working, there are things you can do. I mean, we talked about tobacco and stopping that, and we talked about maintaining good nutrition. We think calcium does help. Calcium supplements, and we think what we really target are women that are postmenopausal.
Okay.
You know what postmenopausal, right? So we target women that are postmenopausal, and we want them to be on about 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day.
Okay.
Now, a very easy way to do that is buy some Tums. I mean, Tums cost just change, really. And one Tums is about 500 milligrams of calcium.
Oh, wow.
So you could take 2 Tums a day, and you're off to a good start.
Call it a thing, and maybe you have a little bit of ease in your stomach along the way.
Right, but actually there is a potential side effect, and I think you and I have talked about this before, is Tums is a chemical called calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate is very constipating.
Oh, that's right.
So you have to be a little bit careful with that. There's other forms of calcium citrate, and I believe there's a product called Citracal. So calcium citrate is a little more friendly, a little less constipating.
Okay.
Doesn't cost a lot, Mike.
Does it absorb in kind of the same way? And I mean, I guess I'm asking, do we get the same efficacy from both?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but probably a little bit different pricing. And then the second thing is vitamin D. Vitamin D is the sun vitamin, And so years ago we told everybody the sun was bad, and they all disappeared indoors, and nobody gets any sun anymore. So vitamin D is absolutely essential to bone metabolism.
Okay.
And vitamin D is found in your diet. I mean, it's in a normal, healthy diet. But you could supplement, and it's relatively inexpensive to do, and it's certainly not harmful in any way that I know. So vitamin D comes not in milligrams like calcium. Vitamin D comes in international units, IUs.
Oh, okay.
And so 800 international units of vitamin D a day with the calcium, we think would be a really good thing.
Okay.
And to be active and weight-bearing and good diet and not smoking. Yes, exactly.
Real quick, and I don't want to sidetrack us into a whole nother issue, but vitamin D, do our bodies still absorb enough vitamin D if we're slathering on the sunscreen when we're going out to play in that softball game? Or do you have to pick some time and not go out quite as shaded with SPFs?
If you're in the sun a reasonable amount of time, regardless of SPFs, you're probably making an adequate amount of vitamin D.
Okay.
But not everybody has the opportunity to do that. You may be homebound.
That's what I was going to say. The elder residents of our community, you get bored, you get lonely, and you sort of sit.
You sit on the couch.
You sit on the couch.
And it hurts to get up and move around, so you don't exercise, you don't have weight bearing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you get the picture.
Definitely.
And so if those senior citizens can get out on the porch, there's a lot of good things about that. The fresh air, the sunshine, the vitamin D. I mean, mentally it's good for you.
Well, it's interesting because I kind of have both kinds of grandparents, or I had both kinds of grandparents. My mother's mother lived to be 97 years old, and she was the one who told you that all those women in their 60s were little old ladies, but she wasn't one of them.
Right.
And she walked everywhere. So she was always outside, sturdy Dutch woman. And then my dad's mother was the wife of a farmer, rancher type, and she was always in the house, very rarely was outside sort of doing stuff.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
And so in me, especially as I've aged, I've kind of watched, and I always compare my two grandmothers and how Grandma Vanderplas was very active and wanted to be active, and she did word search puzzles and crosswords to keep her brain going, and she was always walking, because when she did start having some little TIAs, those little mini strokes, and she had to use a walker, that was the first time I ever heard Grandma swear. Because she did not want to use that darn thing.
Sure, a life change, right?
It's a life change.
Right.
And then Grandma Taylor was sort of the mindset, well, this is my lot in life, and this is what I'm supposed to suffer through. And I always really kind of felt for her and kind of wanted to connect the grandmothers, because, would one have been able to encourage the other? No, go outside and hang up the laundry. Don't throw it in the dryer, and that kind of thing. So really important as we age to stay active. And I didn't realize osteoporosis also factored into that.
And to motivate some of our senior citizens and to support them, because honestly, Mike, they do sit on the couch, and as they do, there are so many potential bad things that can happen.
That is. Now, let's say you've taken the test and the doctor determines, you're prone to osteoporosis. Does the test reveal that, your bones are starting to wither away, for lack of a better word?
Yes, it'll tell you that.
Okay.
It tells you that in sort of a statistical format. It tells you whether you're normal or whether you're 5% below or 10% below, or whether you're above. It does it sort of in a statistical format that I think is hard for patients to understand. They're called T-scores and Z-scores. But yes, absolutely, it tells you that. Now, the hard part is, let's say we do the bone densitometry on a patient, and let's say we institute some lifestyle changes and some treatment. It's a little bit hard to gauge how well that treatment is working.
Okay.
So a year later or 2 years later, we could repeat that densitometry test. And if it's the same number, that doesn't mean it's not working, because often you've prevented a decline.
That's what I was going to say.
And you don't have something to compare it to.
Yeah.
So gauging progress can be a little bit challenging. There are some ways to do that. They're a little bit complicated, but the other thing we do is there is a group of medicine called bisphosphonates, not to throw out a big word, but these medicines work very well in terms of supporting or preventing bone loss, really, is what they do. One is called alendronate. Most patients would recognize it by the name Fosamax.
Okay.
But it's a medicine. It's a prescription medicine, and it's taken once a week. In most cases, you can give it once a day, but in most cases, once a week. And that has tremendous benefit for these kinds of patients. And there's many people in Calaveras and all over the world that are taking them. There's several of them, yeah.
Now, what do you do if the test comes back and it says, you're 20% down? I mean, can you regrow the bones? At that age, as we get older, can we regenerate our bones?
The literature says you can. Clinically, I've never seen that.
I haven't seen it.
I've just not seen people do that. And my patients are very compliant. They're very disciplined. And I just haven't seen people grow bone.
Okay.
Now, the other issue with these medicines is the bone you preserve is not really the same bone. And so if you break your femur's the big bone in the leg, right? If you break your femur, that kind of cracks in half. It kind of has a bending and an elastic quality, and it cracks in half. If you're on these bisphosphonates, that bone becomes very brittle and it doesn't crack anymore. It kind of shatters.
Oh, okay.
So the nature, if you break a bone on the medicine, sometimes these fractures can be much worse and much harder to fix.
Yeah.
But the incidence of those fractures is far, far less than if you weren't on the medicine.
Because the bones are maintaining that strength.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So your bone has some elasticity to it. You wouldn't know that. But it can bend a little bit this way, a little bit this way. And if it breaks, it cracks in half. On these medicines, it shatters.
Oh, goodness.
And so my orthopedic colleagues don't particularly like that, but they understand it happens. But it happens something like 1 in 1,000, 1 in 5,000 patients.
Wow, okay.
Whereas the other fractures are very, very common. So patients need to know about that. They need to be advised about that.
Is this affecting more women than men, as my brain tells me it is, or does osteoporosis kind of affect everyone across the board, who it's going to affect?
Definitely more women than men.
Okay.
But men also have osteoporosis, and it's an area that we're just beginning to learn about. And we're not exactly sure which men are at risk and whether it's a hormonal issue or not, but they clearly get it. And if that same patient would have been a man that walked out the door going for the mail, fell and broke his hip, that's one of these fragility fractures, and I would say de facto he has osteoporosis and should be treated. But we've been engaged in the healthcare of women and osteoporosis, gosh, Mike, for 15 years, probably longer. And with men, we're just starting to learn more about it and just starting to recognize that they can have a similar problem, but probably not to the same extent as women.
Okay. And I would imagine that, again, smoking is going to affect, I mean, if a man is going to have any sort of precursors that might lead to osteoporosis, I would imagine the smoking, as it does with everything else, it just speeds up.
Big risk factor.
Big risk factor,
yeah.
So as usual, you got to quit smoking, folks.
You got to quit smoking.
We're getting down to our last 3 or 4 minutes, and this is one of those diseases that we've all kind of heard about, but we don't really know what we're supposed to do about it. And it sounds like it's one of those where if you're eating right and if you're out and active, you can probably keep things from starting. But like I said, if it does start, and I'm going back now to my mother, I want to say that my mom may have been on Fosamax later in her life.
Probably.
Because she had gone and had and at that time it was called a bone density test or bone density screening. They didn't give it the third word that you're using
DEXA.
from the from
right.
the medical community. But she had been tested, and it wasn't panic. Oh my goodness, Joan's legs are going to come out from under her. But at the same time, it was some calcium and some Fosamax.
Right.
So it sounds like it's another one of those cases where you talk with your doctor and kind of look at what you're doing in your life and kind of go from there.
Yeah, awareness. I mean, if you're watching this show and you know anybody over 60, talk to them, tell them about osteoporosis. The testing's easy, it's paid for. And if it's normal, celebrate. It's a great thing. Keep doing what you're doing.
That's right.
And if there's a bone deficiency, then this is a preventable disease. This is a treatable disease, and the fractures are preventable.
Talking about preventable, is there anything we can do as you're in your 30s and 40s, you know, kind of running up to the 60s, and you know, anything preventative that you can, you know, can you bank calcium?
You know, Mike, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think there's anything you can really do premenopausal. There is a subgroup of people that are young that have very restricted diets, vegan diets, and are skinny, and maybe even technically malnourished. So that group of people could benefit from taking a careful look at what they eat. But as a rule, I'm not really aware of anything you could do.
It's really kind of those, and I don't know, I haven't counted as we've been talking, but those, I don't know, maybe it's the big three. It's, you know, it's watching the diet, it's maintaining your activity, and I'm going to add this one because we've been telling it to children now for 20 years because of video games, but go outside.
Yes. Use your body. Get out and use your body.
Go outside. Go out and garden. Even container garden on the back porch of the mobile home.
Right.
Yeah, there's no reason to be on the computer all the time.
A little bit of sun, a little bit of activity.
Yeah.
Nutrition.
Because the gardening, you're going to be flexing all those joints and muscles and bones anyway. So
Exactly.
It's and obviously do it before you have that misstep going out to get the mail and suddenly discover, oh, I've got osteoporosis.
And I've got a problem.
And I've got a problem because now I know the bones are very weak because I just broke one.
You know, virtually every disease or condition you and I have talked about is improved by doing exactly what you're saying. Almost everyone you and I have talked about is your body is a great thing. Use it. Much better than taking pills.
That's right. And actually much better being outside and away from the couch. So as we've gotten toward the end of this, like we just said, quit smoking. You can't quit smoking soon enough. Go outside. Go enjoy the fact that you've reached your 60s, 70s, or 80s, I would imagine. That's what I plan on doing anyway.
Check up with the doctor.
Check up with your doctor.
Good nutrition.
Good nutrition, and that does it, folks. So, Dr. Randy Smart, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mike Taylor. Be healthy. We keep telling you how you can do it, so just do it, right? We'll see you next time.